McKinney. Angela, do you want to give a brief overview of who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a mindset and recovery coach, and I always say I help people organize their lives from the ground floor up.
Amazing. I was having a look over your site yesterday, and I was thinking that I would very much like to have some coaching for you. That would be amazing. When I was reading about you, I read that you've been sober for 20 years and have recovered from some trauma. What I particularly liked was the phrase that you used to describe that. You said you transform your life from a small hidden life of shame to an abundant, purposeful life. Can you tell me a little bit more about that shame and how you transformed?
I'd love to. Going back, I was sort of born as this young, like it felt like my skin I was born inside out with my skin. I was so sensitive and I was voiceless. I really had no voice or capacity to connect in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
My salvation for me was the stage, was
Yeah.
an artistry, was dance, was theatricality. And it was the only place in my life that I felt safe
Yeah.
until I got sober. I never thought I'd live past the age of 30, to be quite honest. And I got
Wow.
sober when I was 26.
Yeah.
And that journey of finding a voice, finding my own skin, finding a skin that I could feel somewhat safe in was the beginning of untangling a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
What I found was I was one of those eager beaver sober people who jumped in and wanted to jump into all the programs, the money program, the sex and love program,
Yeah.
the food program, because I felt enslaved everywhere.
Yeah.
It wasn't just with the drinking and the drugs, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
And I always feel like, for me, I would get dressed up and drink a bottle of wine and put pearls on, but never leave the house.
Yeah.
I was a small closet user and abuser.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting organized, getting visible, getting into life was really challenging for me.
Yeah.
It continues to be. I was sober for a long time before the trauma piece. I feel like I got a handle on trauma. The thing with trauma that's so debilitating that I see so often with cases I work on is it's hard to get a handle on it.
Yeah.
And we subconsciously just create trauma bonding everywhere. I say I could trauma bond with anything, including my phone. Like I can trauma bond anything with any food, with any type of food, with any person at any given point in time.
What do you
and
mean
it was
by
really
what do you
trauma
mean?
bond?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm recreating a traumatic experience
Okay.
with that relationship
Yeah.
where it's overwhelming and fragmented and chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
And not rooted and organized in a connected, healthy way.
Yeah.
And so a lot of reactivity, a lot of overwhelm, a lot of terror and anxiety states. And what happens when you have a lot of that, at least in my journey, was a collapse, was really collapsing. And I found like if I could just be grateful and small and manage, then I would be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a weird paradigm I had going on 10 years into my sobriety, really. And I realized that, one, I needed to get help. I needed to get my own trauma help. And two, what I discovered in my journey was I actually had to use more of myself in a creative way to overcome my trauma states. And I think the 12 steps, and I love the 12 steps, I still go to meetings, but I think there was a missing lever for me in my journey as far as finding, activating creative, expansive abilities to be with my desires, to be with my sex story, my love story, my money story in an activating way.
Yeah.
I sort of always felt like I needed to get smaller to be safe.
Yeah.
And the journey has been about how to get bigger and increase capacity to thrive and be safe in new ways. And that is an incredible journey. And so I've kind of used all of that experience and put it into programs that I work with people to help them as well.
That sounds incredible. And I totally really relate to the creative aspect. I think there's now this huge growth of creatives in the recovery community. And it's so amazing to see them, for want of a better word, thrive and, develop. And I think, certainly for me, a huge part of my recovery was finding a voice um, and I think creativity is such a fundamental aspect of that. For not just for me, for many of us, it's
Absolutely.
incredible.
Because we go to those black and whites, right? The
Yeah,
alcoholic addict lives in the black and white, which is this punitive internal broken system. And all that black and white stuff does is drive, I call it the wounded female. She
yeah,
just can't, her house is not safe.
yeah,
She's in a constant reactive state. And so there's where she's either avoiding, collapsing, or using, or binging, or getting very disorganized. And if we can reorganize that foundational floor to soften and to activate, because the opposite of the black and white destructiveness sort of energy is creative.
yeah,
And not, so often I think we can get tangled up in trying to fix it, change it, get rid of it, make it better. And that's the punitiveness. So if we can start to learn to convert it and work with it in a new way and activate it into a creative state,
yeah.
then really meet our critical needs in resourceful, healthy ways. And when we can meet those critical needs of love and connection, of our value and significance, of being able to play in the world and belong to the world, then it starts to get so much more fun.
Absolutely. How do you find that the 12 steps sits within that? Because so you're saying that there was a handle missing, and that's certainly something that I'm relating to at the moment. I do you
Okay.
without without giving my own
Yeah,
story. I mean,
absolutely.
what do you want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of let's say somebody was stuck in that rigidity of a 12-step model, and whilst it's been very helpful for me and I'm sure for millions of other people, there is that aspect that's missing. What would you say to somebody that was feeling that way? What advice would you give them?
I would say that I find the missing handle. I love the 12 and 12. I think there's so much value and they outlay it very well. The piece of it that starts to, I think, fall off for me in my work is in the step 6, 7, 8, 9. And those character defects, there's not a real clear understanding of how to convert the defect into an asset. And
Yes.
it's very much kind of like, well, here, take it away. And I feel like that's a very disempowered state with
Yeah.
here, I'm ready. Believe me, I was ready to have all my defects. Just take them away, please.
Yeah.
Just give them. I give them to you. I want nothing to do with them. But it doesn't help the brain organize and create a vision of what it looks like to have it converted to an asset.
Yeah.
Because I find if we don't spend time getting inspired with what it looks like, what it feels like, what it visually could be for us to convert a defect into an asset, our brain does not push ourselves into creating it or embodying it.
No.
And that to me holds the leveraging and the growth and expansion, and also the amending piece, that this is an ongoing amending of getting better and collecting ourselves in ways that allow us to be in this world in more meaningful ways and amend ourselves with all of those defects. That's where I feel the 12 steps lose a lot of ground and get very vague, I think is the word, a little vague for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I have found that certainly from my perspective, we're not focusing on what we're doing right. Recovery for me is
Yes,
a huge self-esteem building exercise. I don't
yes,
feel that it should be to use your phraseology, to be keeping us small. I think
yes,
there is an element of balancing that needs to take place, but
yes,
not shrinking.
Right.
and I don't mean to suggest that that's what the 12 steps do, but I have found, certainly from my perspective, that I have really grown when my philosophy has expanded, and I am thinking, oh, what about this? And and having the freedom to do that is really
Absolutely.
wonderful. And that's what I particularly like about the community that you're building. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what Untangled and Thrive is about, what and your philosophy behind that?
Sure. So Untangle and Thrive really came out of my one-on-one client work. It was a word I was using regularly. Like there's these tangled up states, these tangled reactive states that
Yeah,
break up from organizing and expanding and thriving.
yeah,
And the most tangled, despairing states hold the greatest transformation.
yeah.
So if we can unlock them, we can really start to thrive. So I built this community from my individual work and actually an idea of a book I had in my early sobriety about all of the suffering life stories that are held in our home.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you think of it, I work with a lot of people who are coming out of rehab or disenfranchised or exiled from their home.
Yeah,
They're literally disenfranchised and they're emotionally and spiritually disenfranchised. And my journey back to a home, a safe home of organizing and collecting all of these hidden life stories, because I find with addicts, we have so much shame around our desires.
yeah.
Our desires have tangled us into a lot of broken states and
Mm-hmm.
overreaching and binging or starving and confusing that to be, recovery on some level. And so we don't quite know how to house our desired states
Yeah,
in organized, integrated, healthy ways. So what I love about the community I'm building and the programs I'm building is capturing that home story on a
mm-hmm.
very big level of foundationally gathering a new paradigm mindset, foundational to our housing, our desires, our self-care, our love stories, our sex stories, our money stories, our earning capacity, because I find it's hidden in those earning stories and money stories and sex and love stories where it's like the overwhelm and the brokenness starts to really take people or hijack people, as I say.
Yeah, because I think sometimes we can look at those natural instincts as
Yeah, that's
defective,
right.
right? And I guess
That's right.
actually they are natural human instincts.
That's
We on
right.
a very basic level, we were brought here to procreate, right? It's just that
Yes.
addiction has taken us to the extreme where they become addictive, right? Um,
Exactly.
yeah,
So how to deal with that? Like everyone knows the opposite of it. The
yeah,
anorexia, like, well, that's not safe, so I'm just going to starve. And that how somehow I was in that state and for so long in my recovery that getting safe with the desires and those needs, that it's okay to want more. I had to make it so okay to want again in a
yeah.
healthy way. And that journey is so powerful, and to put a safe structure around holding that and getting inspired with purpose behind it
Yeah.
really helps us come out of the shadows. It really does.
What does feeling safe within that space look like? What could you I I mean I'd imagine it's quite a thorough process, but is it possible to give an overview of what that would look like?
Great question. um, I think when we can let ourselves into those deep meaningful desires around earning more money, for example,
Yeah.
we can start to attune to the desires and the needs without judgment, but with curiosity.
Mm.
We can invite ourselves to organize and gather a cohesive vision of what we would have ourselves doing every day and activating into our day. Because if we don't, that's where safety is. The security comes inside of ourselves with a meaningful process around whatever it is, dating, making more money, trying new things. If I make it really safe to play
Mhm.
and more moved by the experience of getting in front of a video camera, which by the way was traumatizing to me 6 months ago.
Me too.
I was like, I can't do this, So I had to untangle that relationship to a camera to go, well, what's meaningful about the journey of being seen? Like, how
Yeah.
can I own that and be safe with it, regardless of if people like it or they don't like it? Like, for myself to determine what the meaningful piece is makes it safe.
Yeah. And would you say that with that curious observer, if you
Yeah.
like, to detach judgment is
Yeah.
perhaps a really useful exercise. I think so often we're looking at things as good and bad, and it's, how is it
Mm-hmm.
humble and showing humility to want to earn money and be successful and all of those
Yes,
things.
exactly. What happens when you've had a lot of trauma is your critical need for consistency and safety overreach and becomes hypervigilant.
Yeah.
And that hypervigilance sort of suffocates us
Yeah.
to not being able to play,
Yeah.
right? Or make a mistake, God forbid, or risk getting vulnerable or being seen.
Yeah.
And so we really have to reorganize and redirect. Our need for safety and consistency needs to be met in some other areas around love and connection, around our significance, and around variety, playfulness. And
Yeah.
when we can resourcefully meet those needs and give ourselves that space, again, that environment of non-judgment and curiosity, we expand what I call the stabilizing floor, that internal floor, to move in the world and have more fulfilling experiences.
That sounds amazing. I mean, I feel really inspired talking to you because I really relate to a lot of the journey, and I can see, I'm 5 years in recovery, and I'm aware that a lot of growth happens from like the five. I mean, it's continuous growth, but from the 5 to 10, and then it blows my mind every day. What are some of the success stories of the people that you work with?
Oh, gosh, they really vary. I work with very high functioning people who want to go bigger in their earnings
Hmm.
story, to people who make a lot of money who want to go more meaningful in their sex and love story. And then the disenfranchised client cases that I've had where they've been in rehabs 20 and 25 times. The
Wow.
most meaningful piece I find is when I can help build a team that appropriately provides an environment for whatever that looks like for my client to really belong to their lives and their families and their children and their work. It is just, even if it's just the mom, that they can
Yeah.
be with their mom in a more meaningful way, or that they can let go of the father and show up in a way that brings them to tears. It's very individual and specific, but I find there are always the profound little moments where people are just in life and connecting,
Yeah.
and they're being moved by that experience.
That must be so fulfilling for
It
you.
really is. I
Yeah.
had a I had a gentleman call me from his 25th rehab, and he was in a relapse, and he was directed through a client of mine. He was friends with her, and she said, "You got to call this woman; she'll help you." He was stuttering. He had been to 3 hospitals that day, and he was
Oh,
he was so overwhelmed. And I knew, I always feel like I can hear into the stuttering, disenfranchised state to go, you know what? If you want to house this and get well, like, it's possible.
yeah.
Like, it's possible. And he did. He was willing to get in there and untangle these trauma sort of bonding situations that he did with rehab, and find a new relationship to himself, to going to treatment again, to taking it in and having it be a positive experience, to reorganizing his relationships with his mom and his father. So it's amazing. It
How
really
does
is.
it sounds it? How does what you do? Because I saw from your from the research that I did that you can work with a team of
Yes,
specialists.
yes.
How do you work together? Is it well? I guess I'll just ask that question. How do you work together? What does it look like?
Yeah, sure. It looks different, but with those complex cases,
Hmm.
I immediately bring in a team. I bring in the psychiatrist. I bring in a therapist, usually a trauma specialized therapist, a trauma psychiatrist often. People who've suffered with addiction many times have underlying mental illnesses that need proper treatment.
Yeah.
And I find, not all the time, but more in these complex cases, it's very noisy and they get thrown into addict, addict, addict. Oh, and I'm so much more curious with the driver of it.
Yeah.
And I luckily have gathered some incredible people in my in my network to support getting an accurate diagnosis. I can't tell you the millions of dollars people can spend and not even get an accurate diagnosis.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
yeah, because they're just classified as an addict, right? And that they suffer with the disease of addiction, and it's such a broad brushstroke, right? And I mean, I don't even know after 5 years where I sit with the disease model. I certainly am not sure whether I identify with it. What I know is that I have suffered with addiction, but what I also know is that I have a long history of depression, and I self-medicated and then became addicted.
Thank you. I do too.
Yeah, right. And I just find that well, let's ask you this question. What would you how would I ask this? What do you think is the predominant causes of people becoming addicted? You've touched on trauma, you've touched on mental illness. Are there any others that you would say could cause that state?
I really feel developmental trauma, early childhood developmental trauma, and depression and anxiety. A lot of my clients suffer from debilitating anxiety disorders that drive it as well. And then there's a whole other group of people who have real disassociation from the anxiety and into DID and identity disorder and disassociation, and you can get into several layers of drivers. And I just find that those people don't get the time needed to go into a real deep diagnostic, because the good news is, as I always say, I'm a data collector for these doctors because I'm in the trenches with them. I hear their rhythm. I see their patterns. I talk to them twice a day, right? So I'm collecting data for the doctors to then put the pieces together for an accurate diagnosis.
Yeah.
But I'm with you, depression, early childhood developmental trauma, which most people don't understand the complexities of that.
Yeah.
Greatly to self-harm, self-medicating, self-soothing, isolationist, and suffering, just deep suffering.
So could you say that it is not helpful to put everybody in that same pot as you're an addict, and it can be quite a confining diagnosis?
I agree. I think it can be. I think it's helpful for people to identify as an addict for their recovery. Like, again, our brain needs to get out of vagueness. And so that clarity of saying, look, I use X, Y, and Z, and it's destructive. So I need to clarify and clean up that behavior. And if that's an addict, I think it's helpful, because then it's like, I don't drink no matter what, right?
Yeah.
It's very clear. My brain can kind of take that and understand it and organize with it. So ambivalence is not helpful in recovery.
No.
But I do know what you mean about seeing it from like a disease point of view or a disease model, like cancer, for example. And I'm with you. I don't treat it like that or look at it that way.
No.
But to me, it's just a symptom of so many other impairments, and largely the inability to connect. I mean, it's really vulnerability and connection that so many of us struggle to organize well into, and being seen and knowing knowing how to meet our needs in healthy, resourceful ways, because we, for whatever reason, weren't given that or provided that environment.
Yeah, and there's there's such a need to go underneath the addiction and addictive behaviors, which is exactly what you seem to be doing, which I think is so valuable. I got to that place in my recovery where I felt the 12 steps only took me so far. I needed to go deeper. I needed to understand why. I mean, my brain is programmed that way anyway. Um,
Yes.
which is fortunate because I don't want to carry on living in that way. I don't want to stagnate in recovery. Recovery is growth to me.
That's right.
That's wonderful. What would you? So my kind of philosophy is making things accessible for all. What would you say to somebody um, what advice would you give to somebody who couldn't afford coaching or a specialist team? How would you go about uncovering those things? What access points could those people?
It's so important, you're right, because it is expensive. I work with trauma psychiatrists. I only wish I had had the financial ability to work with. I
I
sort of
know
feel
it's
like I had to figure all this out on my own. I've had a
yeah.
lot of sexual trauma states in my life. And I remember when I first untangled a sexual trauma for
Mhm.
myself, I facilitated my own coaching. I knew I was like, oh, this is what's required, this ability to be with that and also ask some new questions and be with it
Mm.
this way and reorganize myself. And from that point, that was about 7 years ago, from that point, I kind of make it part of my practice to, and I feel like that's what I'm building. And for the people who can't afford the individual coaching, or the group environment is critical, in my opinion. Even if it's the 12 steps,
Yeah.
focusing in on any area that holds suffering for you, to
Mhm.
get a voice around it, to get safety in a new way and learn some new behaviors,
Mhm.
as well as the smart recovery. I think smart recovery offers a lot of great science and evidence-based research around organizing your thinking in a new way. So plugging into community and groups and finding and putting yourself in an environment of people who are transforming, and who your environment is very important,
Yeah.
because they just being around successful people or people who have what you want, it starts to get into your DNA, it starts to get into your
Yeah.
cells.
Yeah.
And knowing what you want is part of the journey.
Yeah.
It's like 85 or 90% of people in the world know what they don't want.
Yeah.
Very few know what they want, because knowing what you want is vulnerable,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you made such an important point there about surrounding yourself with people that are in those places of growth and development and have what you want.
Yeah,
I think we make this assumption, this has certainly been my journey, that because I'm around other people in recovery, that those are
yeah,
my people, and that's not necessarily the case. There are some
that's
people in
right.
recovery that are not my people. My people are creatives and people that want to grow and are continually developing, and just in speaking to you for a short period of time, I feel really inspired and motivated.
Right.
This is recovery to me.
That's
um,
right. Yes.
I think it's amazing what you're doing. The philosophies you have is around self-care and the importance of building um, organized routine. And as I focus on health and wellness, could you
Yes.
talk a little bit about what tips you would give for self-care in a recovery program?
Sure. Well, I think self-care starts with, again, that curious mind of hearing into your needs and
Mm-hmm.
being responsible to service them.
Yeah.
And so that journey changes with food and exercise. I think when we get rigid and it has to look a certain way, we're chopping ourselves off from really attuning to our self-care needs. So for me now, I'm so busy. Grabbing a 20-minute walk and listening to music is self-care.
Yeah.
Getting my nails done or getting a massage or touched once a week, self-care. Food, taking good care of food. I tend to to really learn a lot about people's food behavior, routines, and habits, or neglect, that we're, again, not ping-ponging between starving ourselves and overindulging. That middle road seems to be the journey of healthy self-care, is connection and flexibility. Because some days I need something else from myself than other days, and that it's okay. I think the rigidity creates a lot of despair. So the more attuned and kind of checking in with yourself regularly throughout the day, listening deeper, getting more curious with what you're needing from yourself, and then providing it, like the follow through, connecting.
Yeah. What does that voice sound like? I think because to some people they are so far removed from what their instincts are telling them. What does it sound like to you? If your body is saying, I need this.
Yes, it sounds like I tune in. I think the body holds so much information.
Right.
And so when it's overwhelmed, and a lot of times overwhelm starts to drive the binging addict person.
Yeah.
And so I would track whatever your emotional response is. It's fear, overwhelm, or anxiety tend to be the triggering lead-ins to either abandonment. What does abandonment look like? It looks like when I just plow into, or I start calling that guy obsessively, or, I start whatever, right? Yeah. What does that look like? And then again, holding the abandonment, getting curious and going, oh, that's not self-care, that's self-destruction.
Yeah.
Convert that to what would I feel good about doing for myself now, knowing that that's not, and there's where people have to spend more time, because we have to ask the question to gather the connection to overwhelm in our body. And all times I find that if we can just walk and shake, there's something about just physically discharging overwhelmed states, that if you can just intercept and grab a 5-minute walk and shake your body like the animal who's almost been killed, and you shake the overwhelm off, you can return to hearing your voice down lower in a new way.
I think that's what's so powerful about Kundalini Yoga, isn't it? Because it's the movement of, the discharge. And I remember when I first tried it, I initially felt, oh my God, what is this? And then, oh my God, what is it? It was amazing.
So bringing those little practices throughout your day to regulate overwhelm, I feel like is the best self-care you can do. So for the people who are so loud, what they're doing with overwhelm is typically abandoning themselves.
Yeah.
If they can intercept and build a practice to shake the overwhelm and get more curious with, oh, I'm hungry and I just need a good meal. So what would that be? Okay, let's take myself out and have a nice lunch. Yeah. Great. Yeah. That sort of attunement is critical to increasing self-care.
That's amazing. Thank you.